and welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and these are the most underrated lands in the Commander format, in my opinion. I made a video a little while ago talking about the most underrated Commander cards, but I realized I did not include any lands in that list, and I probably should have, so I thought, let's just make a list entirely on the lands in the format that are super underrated, that aren't played nearly enough. And again, underrated means that, yes, they're probably known, and they are probably in a decent amount of decks, maybe in some cases on this list, a considerable amount of decks, but not nearly as many as they should, right? These are cards that I think are fantastic that should be in way more decks than they currently are. And again, I'm using EDH Rec stats here for this, but as usual, I'm also using my eyeballs because I don't see these cards nearly enough. And lands are particularly important when talking about underrated or cards that are not played enough, because of course it's so easy to shoehorn them into your deck. You're already got to put lands in your deck to tap for mana, so why not throw in one of these lands that can give you some other added benefit as well? So I'm going to start out with Grove of the Guardian, which of course is a land, taps to add a colorless mana. You can pay 3 green and a white and tap it, and tap 2 untapped creatures you control. Sacrifice Grove of the Guardian, put an 8/8 green and white elemental creature token with vigilance onto the battlefield. Pretty neat, I think. This is a land that early in the game I just play it. I'm using it as I normally would to tap for mana. It doesn't enter the battlefield tapped or anything like that. Later in the game, I need a little bit of help closing out the game. You can do this at instant speed. On my opponent's end step, I pay 5 mana, tap down 2 of my creatures, and put a giant elemental token into play, which is going to be a fantastic blocker as well if I'm getting a little low on my life, but now I can use it to help close out the game. I think having an 8/8 vigilance creature later in a game can be really, really handy. Again, you can just throw it at your opponents, but still have a pretty decent blocker if your life total is getting low. I think this is a card that could go in a lot more decks. It's only in 6,500 decks currently on EDH Rec, and I think it's a pretty good one, especially because it's in white and green colors, which makes it really easy to slot into a lot of themes there. Coming in at number 9, let's talk about Desert. That's right, just the original card named Desert. Taps to add a colorless mana again, and tap Desert deals 1 damage to target attacking creature. Activate only during the end of combat step. This is a card that I think could very easily slot into a whole lot of decks if you got the room, even though it doesn't look like it's doing a whole lot, like 1 damage only to attacking creatures, but I think you would be surprised how often that is usable in a Commander game. And of course, it doesn't have to be attacking you, right? That's what I like about this card. It just sits on the battlefield, and if at any point during the game, one of your opponents is attacking with a creature that is attacking someone else, let them get in for damage, because of course you can only activate it on the end of combat step anyway. You can kill that creature if it has a 1 toughness, or if we're in the situation where your opponent thinks their attacking creature is safe because the other opponent doesn't have a big enough blocker, maybe they've taken 3 damage, that creature's got a 4 toughness, now you can finish it off. There is that scenario as well. And there also is the scenario where you want to deal damage to your own creatures, right? You can use this on your own stuff. You're playing that Jared Carthalion deck. I want to shoot my own commander for a damage after it's attacked. That scenario works as well. I think this card could see more play. It's a pretty neat one in a Commander game. Let's talk about Drth Ruins, which came out in March of the Machine Aftermath, and I think a lot of cards from that set see a little bit less play than they might because maybe there's some animosity with that set. I don't know. I think this is a pretty fantastic land that can go in any Commander deck and can give you a really nice bonus. Taps to add a colorless, pay 2 and tap, put 2 +1/+1 counters on target non-human creature that entered the battlefield this turn. So this is currently in about 8,500 decks. That's not a ton. It's okay. But for a card that could go in any deck and has a really nice added bonus, I mean, I guess unless you're playing a human tribal deck or your commander's a human, I guess it's not great there. But in any other deck, it can be pretty good because I just got some mana open. I just played my commander. Why not throw a couple counters on it? That's usually a nice added bonus. But of course, there's a whole lot of commanders out there that really, really want those counters on them. They just want to be bigger, or maybe you're in that +1/+1 counter theme. I think there's a lot of people that might not even know this card exists, that it could very easily slot into their deck. Again, it's just a land that produces mana, doesn't enter the battlefield tapped, so it's very easy to just replace a land you already have with this if it works in your deck. All right, getting to a little more fringe stuff, and this one, of course, is going to stick out because it's unlike any other land on this list because it does not produce mana. This is the only one here that doesn't produce mana. Halls of Mist. It is a land, has cumulative upkeep 1. Creatures that attacked during their controller's last turn can't attack. And even though this is a land that doesn't produce mana, so I guess we're not in a situation where you could just take out a land to put this in. This is probably going to take the place of a non-land slot in your deck, but I think this could be really really great, especially later in the game. I mean, I guess there is the situation where you could play it earlier in the game. If your opponent's playing like the Edgar Markov deck or that Krenko deck or some really powerful aggro-y deck, it can be a lifesaver. But I think likely it's going to be played more later in the game. And there's a lot of situations where this can be great. You can just use this as a one-shot, almost like a fog effect, where your opponent's got a bunch of creatures and they just attacked you and they're trying to get you out of the game. So they just attacked me with all their creatures. Now I drop this down and they cannot attack with those creatures next turn, right? It basically fogs them for one turn. Fogs your other opponents as well, right? This isn't just targeting one guy. No creature can attack if it attacked during the last turn. And then I don't have to pay the upkeep at all if I don't want to. I can just let it go to the graveyard and it's a one-time free fog effect essentially, which ain't bad. If I'm in any deck where I can get my lands out of the graveyard, now it gets even better. I can also just keep it around, right? It just basically cuts your opponent's attacking in half essentially. So if they attack with all their creatures, they can't attack the next turn, which cuts it in half. Or if they attack with half their creatures, then they can only attack with the other half in the next turn. Either way, it's cutting the damage that is being dealt in half, and that can be really, really great in a lot of situations. This card is only in 651 decks on EDH Rec, which is essentially nothing. Again, I'm talking about these cards where it's in quite a bit of decks, but it should be played in more decks. I don't think this card goes in every deck, but 651 is essentially nothing, probably because a lot of people don't know this card exists, and maybe you want to try it out in your deck. Again, I don't think I would probably put this in a land slot, but it can be a really neat fit. Try it out in one of your decks. You might like it. Let's talk about Tomb Fortress. Now we're going in the other direction, where this is a card that's actually in a decent amount of decks. It isn't in 13,000 decks on EDH Rec, but man, when I first saw this card come out in Warhammer 40k last year, I thought it was going to be in every black deck that it could possibly shoehorn into. I thought this would be more like 100,000 decks, right? That's where I'm going with this one. This one does enter the battlefield tap. It taps to add a black though, so you're getting that black mana you need, and has 2 black, exile Tomb Fortress, mill 4 cards, then return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery. So this is a land that is recursion for a creature, which is fantastic. Every single commander deck wants to be doing that, some more so than others. I mean, I don't think I need to convince people why having a land that can reanimate a creature is good. I mean, sure, it costs 5 plus this, so that's essentially 6. So what? Later in a game, my commander dies, I can just let it go to the graveyard, and then on my turn, I just use this to get it back, rather than paying the 8 or 10 mana or whatever I would have to do from the command zone. You know, again, for me, this is just a card where I'm like, why wouldn't I try to find room for this in my black deck? So 13,000 is not bad, but I thought this would be in way more decks. I thought it would be one of the most popular lands in the format because of what it's doing. There is no commander deck that doesn't want to be doing this, right? Coming in at number 5, and I am cheating a little bit here. I'm actually cheating quite a bit here because, of course, as you can probably tell, this is an enchantment, in fact, a legendary enchantment, Path of Metal. So why am I talking about this? Well, of course, it is a transform card, and the back is a land. So yeah, I am cheating a little bit here, but it's my video. I'll do what I want. Let's go back and look at the front side first. So Path of Metal, red and a white legendary enchantment. It enters the battlefield, and when it does, it deals 1 damage to each creature that doesn't have first strike, double strike, vigilance, or haste. So you probably want to put it in a deck where you're doing something like that, right? And I've tried to shoehorn this into a bunch of decks, mostly because I want that backside, which I will get to. The 1 damage to those creatures can be really good. I mean, you can get really lucky and just have your opponent playing, again, that Krenko deck or maybe a Sapperling Tribal deck, and I could just get a whole bunch of creatures off the battlefield with this. Can be a blowout sometimes for just 2 mana, but what you mostly want it for, of course, is the backside, and you want to be able to transform it, which you can do when you attack with at least 2 creatures that have first strike, double strike, vigilance, and or haste, which isn't really that difficult at all if your commander has any of those abilities, right? If I have a commander in red and white that have at least one of those abilities, I've already fulfilled the 1 creature, so I only need 1 more. So it's really not that hard to flip this card, and the backside, I think, is phenomenal. So again, it's a land, Metzali, Tower of Triumph. It taps to add 1 mana of any color. That's pretty good, right? We always want a land that's doing that, but it has 2 really, really great abilities, I think, in a Commander game. Pay 1 in a red and tap. Metzali Tower of Triumph deals 2 damage to each opponent. So there's something you want to be doing always in every game, right? So if I just have mana open, my opponent's end step, I got 3 lands sitting open, I can use this, deal 2 damage to each of my opponents. Pretty darn good. I also like this other ability, 2 and a white, tap, choose a creature at random that attacked this turn, destroy that creature. Again, something you always can be doing. I got mana open, I just sink it into this, destroy a random creature that attacked this turn, and of course, if my opponent is attacking with their Voltron commander, that's probably the only creature that is attacking, and this is choose a creature at random that attacked this turn. This gets around hexproof. That's actually maybe a niche way to use it, but a really great way to use it. My opponent has that giant hexproof commander that I can't target, and I don't have to take the damage. This is just a creature that attacked this turn. So as soon as they declare it as an attacker, I can pay the mana and destroy that Voltron commander with hexproof before it actually does any damage to me. So 2 really, really great abilities, I think, in a commander game. I've done it a couple times, had this one flipped over, and you just have this land sitting there. I always am leaving mana open. Maybe I want to destroy an attacking creature if need be, and if not, I'll just deal 2 damage to each of my opponents before I untap on my turn. Really great land in the commander format, but of course you got to transform it first. That's the only downside there. This is only in about 2,700 decks currently on EDH Rec, which is not much at all, and I think it could probably fit in a lot more. Getting back to the actual lands, let's talk about Tower of the Magistrate. Taps to add a colorless like most of the lands on this list do, and you can pay 1 and tap. Target creature gains protection from artifacts until end of turn. Why would you want to use this card? That's a very fringe ability, right? And funny enough, I used to do my 10 cards you should be putting in your commander decks videos on my channel, and I started having this guy appearing in the comments constantly telling me that I should talk about Tower of the Magistrate on my videos, but of course I was doing those videos in alphabetical order and I hadn't gotten to T yet. When I did, I decided I would talk about it on those videos because that guy gave me a really good reason why this card can be fantastic in a commander game. I thought he was kidding. I'm like, target creature gains protection from artifacts? That seems awful. But that's because as you see this card, you typically think of using it on your own creatures, right? Giving your own creatures protection from artifacts is not great. It is usable, but you mostly want to be using this on your opponent's creatures. And of course, the reason why is because, as I've talked about in my protection video, protection prevents targeting, but it also prevents equipping, right? You cannot equip a creature if it has protection from that color, but of course, equipment usually doesn't have a color. In this case, though, you're giving protection from artifacts, and all equipment are indeed artifacts. So this will prevent a creature from being equipped with anything. And of course, it's until end of turn. So if my opponent has their commander enter the battlefield, they want to throw that lightning greaves on it right away because they don't want it to be targeted, or maybe they want to attack with it right away. I respond with 1 mana, tap this thing, give their commander protection from artifacts, and now it cannot be equipped with that lightning greaves for the rest of the turn. And of course, they likely can't be doing it on anyone else's turn as well, so they likely will not be able to put that lightning greaves on their commander until their next turn, which is going to very much, well, I mean, first of all, they won't be able to attack with it, but also it's likely I will be able to remove it before they do that. And there can even be that situation where maybe your opponent is attacking with that creature that already has equipment on it, assuming it doesn't have hexproof or shroud. Now I can give that creature protection from artifacts, and the artifacts will fall off, right? Again, that's how protection works, just like with auras, where if it's already got the stuff on it, I give it protection from artifacts. Any artifacts already on it will fall off. So it works there as well. Really neat ability to have stapled on a land in a commander game. This is currently only in 3,000 decks. Again, that's essentially nothing, so I think it could probably fit in a few more. Let's talk about Underdark Rift. This is a land that I sort of skipped over, totally missed it myself, even though I'm a guy that absolutely loves removal. And I talked about Ominous Cemetery recently, which came out in Doctor Who, which I think is a fantastic land that is probably going to not be played in enough decks. So there's another one I could add to the list. I think that's a great option for creature removal on a land. Probably the best, but I had someone say, hey, what about Underdark Rift? That's a pretty great removal option on a land as well. And I agree, it is a great one and not nearly in enough decks. So taps to add a colorless, pay 5 and tap, exile Underdark Rift, roll a d10. Put target artifact, creature, or planeswalker into its owner's library just beneath the top X cards of that library, where X is the result. Activate only as a sorcery. So this is not as good as Ominous Cemetery in that you can't do it at instant speed. Ominous Cemetery you can, which I think, in my opinion, makes it a lot better. It also is just going to likely get rid of that creature permanently because it's shuffling it into the library. Maybe not. I don't love rolling in the Commander format or in Magic in general because you never know what result you're going to get. But worst case scenario here, you roll a 1 and you put that artifact, creature, or planeswalker beneath the top card of that player's library, so they're not going to get it back for a while. It it is a pretty good removal option. Obviously, it works on artifacts and planeswalkers as well, which could be good. It can be a lifesaver, right? I always like to play out the Blightsteel Colossus scenario, you know? That's why I like lands like this, right? People will look at this and they'll go, oh man, 5 mana plus this, that's essentially 6 mana to get rid of a creature. That's awful. But this is a colorless option that can go in any deck that is stapled on a land. And when that scenario arises, yeah, it costs a lot of mana, but it's better than just dying, right? I like having those options on lands because it's so easy to shoehorn them into your decks. This is a great card. It's in 11,000 decks. That's not that bad. But again, underrated. I think it should be in a whole bunch more. Coming in at number 2, a card that very quickly became one of my favorite lands in the Commander format, Hostile Hostel. I absolutely love this card, and there is not very many color-specific cards on this list. I would say the majority of the ones I'm talking about this list probably could fit in any deck. This one, unfortunately, only goes in black decks because of the back, but I think it works in a lot of those decks, which is why I think it should get played more. It's only in 8,300 decks on EDH Rec currently. I have never seen anyone play this card other than me. I have it in a couple of decks because I absolutely love it. So taps to add a colorless. So again, there's not really any drawback here, right? This is a land that enters the battlefield untapped, and I can tap it right away to add mana. So it's very easy for me to just take a swamp out of my deck to put this in instead, I think. Pay 1 and tap, sacrifice a creature, put a soul counter on Hostile Hostel. Then if there are 3 or more soul counters on it, remove those counters, transform it, and untap it. Activate only as a sorcery. So the activate only as a sorcery obviously makes this card a little bit worse. It'd be really nice if you could activate it whenever you want. Maybe too good though. So I'm okay with that. Obviously, if you're already sacrificing creatures, this is, in my opinion, an easy slot. And first of all, it is a sack outlet on a land. And I mean, High Market is a sack outlet on a land that gets played in way more decks than this does. Of course, it's not black, so it can go in any deck. This can only go in decks that have black, but a whole lot of black decks are sacrificing creatures. So this should be in way more decks, in my opinion, because I think the backside is an incredibly neat card, which you will then flip over into if you get those 3 soul counters. It's a creature. It's an artifact creature horror construct, Creeping In. It's a 3/7. Whenever Creeping In attacks, you may exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of creature cards exiled with Creeping In, and it has pay 4, Creeping In phases out. So I originally had this in my Kuon deck, and that's the first time I actually got to use it. I flipped it over very easily and closed out the game with it because, of course, that's a sacrifice theme. I had a bunch of creatures in my graveyard that I could easily exile. I just left the 4 mana open. If you were playing this and you got it flipped over, just leave that 4 mana open. Again, phasing out is the best way to protect your stuff. Your opponents will never get at this off the battlefield. Anytime a board wipe is cast, removal, whatever, just pay 4 mana and phase it out. It has a huge butt, so you don't really care who you're attacking because it's likely your opponents won't be able to kill it in combat. And whenever you swing, you're just going to be draining all your opponents. I know people might say they don't love this in their graveyard theme because, of course, it's exiling cards from your graveyard, but I think you're going to have enough there. You know, if I'm playing a Marin deck, I probably have enough creatures in my graveyard that it's okay if I exile a couple of them, right? I don't have to exile them all. I'm only exiling 1 at a time. I love that it's keeping track of the cards that you exile here, right? There's no counters or nothing. It's just each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of creature cards exiled with Creeping In. So as you're exiling those creatures, this number gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I think it's a really neat card. It is a sack outlet on the front, remember, which can be very usable. You don't have to flip it over at all. You can just use it a couple times as a sack outlet. And again, we're getting later in the game. I need some help closing out the game. I flip this guy over and it's a great way to do that. I think it's a really neat card. I absolutely love it. And I think it's horribly underplayed in the format. All right, coming in at number 1 for me is Toria West. And this, funny enough, is the most popular card on this list. It's in 27,000 decks on EDH Rec. So by far, it is the most popular one that I'm talking about here today. But I have it at number 1 because, again, we're in the scenario where it could be in way more decks, or should be at least, I think, in way more decks than it currently is in. I think this could be in every single blue deck very easily. So Toria West is a land, of course, and enters the battlefield tapped, which isn't super great. I don't love lands that enter the battlefield tapped, but it's not a huge downside. It does tap to add blue, so you're getting the blue mana you need. So of course, this can only go in blue decks. That's fine. Transmute 1 blue, which is one of my favorite mechanics of all time. I wish they would revisit it. For all those who don't know what it does, it means I pay the 3 mana and discard this card, search my library for a card with the same mana value, put it into my hand, can, and of course in this case, the mana value is 0, so I'm searching my library for a card with a mana value 0 and putting it into my hand. Now of course that's not a lot. You can have maybe a Astra Cornucopia or Everflowing Chalice, right? Those are some popular cards in the format. Maybe you got a Jeweled Lotus, some more powerful 0 mana cards in the Commander format, but mostly why I think this card is just a super easy slot into any blue deck, it is a land tutor, right? Blue doesn't tutor for lands very well. Really, it doesn't do it at all, and this is a way to tutor for other lands in your deck in blue. Obviously, if you're in green, you don't have a problem, so in a Simic deck, maybe you don't want this. Outside of a Simic deck, this is a very easy slot in to a mono blue deck, a white blue deck, a black blue deck. If I'm in a Dimir deck, I can use this to go get my Cabal Coffers. My opponent has a Cabal Coffers of their own that I want to get off the table. I use this to go get my Wasteland. So there's a lot of really neat things you can get with this card, but for me, the reason why it should go in a whole lot more decks than it is currently in is because it is a mono blue way to tutor for lands, and like all the lands I talked about on this list and so many more in the format, there's a whole bunch of lands that are probably in your deck that you're going to want to go get, and you can do it with this card. That's why I think it should be in more decks. All of these cards I think should be in more decks than they are currently in. They're the 10 most underrated lands in the format, in my opinion. If you are thinking of purchasing any of these because I've convinced you that they are good for your deck, or maybe you've never even heard of them before and you want to give them a try, I do have a TCG Player link. It is in the description below. Feel free to give it a click. That is it for today though, and thanks for tuning in.